Our three European leaders are making a surprise visit to the Ukrainian capital as fighting rages around the city. Prime ministers from the Czech Republic, Poland and Slovenia are in Kyiv. It's the first visit by foreign leaders since Russia launched its invasion last month. Ukraine's capital will impose a 36-hour curfew from tonight until Thursday as Russia's bombardment intensifies. At the same time, there are renewed hopes of a diplomatic solution. Peace talks between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators are set to resume. On live to our correspondents in Western Ukraine, Poland and Latvia in just a moment. But first, a look at Russia's continued offensive on the capital.
As dawn broke, the damage became clear. A series of powerful explosions rocked Ukraine's capital overnight, sending columns of smoke high into the sky. Airstrikes have targeted the residential districts. This housing block went up in flames. At least 2 people have been killed so far. Russian forces claim to have taken full control over Ukraine's southern Kherson region and says it's shot down several Ukrainian aircraft.
На военном аэродроме под Краматорском уничтожены 3 ангара, в которых находилось 4 украинских штурмовика Су-25, 1 вертолет Ми-24 и 5 вертолетов Ми-8.
But a calmer security situation in the southern region of Mykolaiv. Authorities say Russian forces have been pushed back slightly from the regional capital, which they have been trying to seize. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has urged Russian forces to surrender.
Российские срочники, послушайте меня особенно внимательно. Российские офицеры, вы-то все уже поняли. У Украины вы ничего не заберете. Вы будете забирать жизни. Вас очень много. Мы даем вам шанс выжить. Если сдадитесь нашим силам, мы будем обращаться с вами так, как и положено обращаться с людьми. Именно с людьми, достойно. Как с вами не обращались в вашей армии. И как ваша армия не обращается с нашей. Выбирайте.
One of President Zelensky's top aides says the war could be over by May or within weeks, as they believe Russia has run out of fresh troops to keep fighting. At the same time, more evacuation efforts. Ukraine hopes to open 9 humanitarian corridors to provide safe passage for civilians to flee the fighting. The United Nations says more than 3 million people have left Ukraine since the start of the war.
The wind, huh?
And Philip Crowther joins us live from Lviv in Western Ukraine. Philip, the Kremlin says it is positive that peace talks are continuing, but do we know if any progress has been made?
No, not at this point. These are the peace talks, or rather talks, we should probably call them, that happened yesterday between Ukraine and Russia already via video conference. They will be continued today after what the Ukrainian side called a technical pause. Now, there are 2 ways of looking at these talks. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described yesterday's talks as, quote, good, so a positive note from the Ukrainian side, but no breakthroughs to tell you about, frankly. And the Russian interpretation of talks so far is certainly not an optimistic one. It is this one. The work is difficult. This is coming from the Kremlin. The positive thing is the continuation of the work. So the good thing is that they are actually talking. And yes, that is sometimes considered remarkable that these 2 countries are talking despite Russia's invasion now entering its 3rd week. What we can expect, though, in terms of results from these talks is probably the best case scenario, local ceasefires, humanitarian corridors, the likes of which simply have not worked out over the last few days. Now, you mentioned already this remarkable visit by the leaders from Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovenia going to Kyiv today, a city that has come under attack just today. It's supposed to be a show of solidarity. A European Union mission, says the Czech Republic. So that will be quite something to see. The very first visit by leaders from foreign countries to Ukraine since the start of the Russian invasion.
Now, Philip, also in Kyiv, there were a 36-hour curfew and there are reports of a countrywide air raid warning. Is the situation on the ground getting more tense?
Yes, it absolutely is. This is a city that has been preparing for these 3 weeks of the Russian invasion of Ukraine already for a siege, potentially, from Russian forces. We all know that one of the military objectives would be for Russia to essentially take over the country. That would be done through taking over the capital city or possibly encircling it as much as possible, creating another siege, as Russian forces have done in the likes of Mariupol in the southeast of the country. Now, we know that there have been several attacks over the last 24 hours. Here's what we heard from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He says 4 buildings were bombarded and there are dozens dead. We can't confirm that on our end, but residential buildings were hit last night, not military targets. So that appears to be a tactic used by Russia, similar to what we've seen in the likes of Mariupol and Kharkiv, the country's second largest city in the north. Now, there have also been attacks in other parts of the country. Nothing over the last day and a half or so here in the west, but an attack on a TV tower in Rivne, that's here in the west of the country, has led to a new death toll of 19 now. And air raid sirens have been heard throughout the country, and here in the daytime as well, here in Lviv, considered pretty much a safe city here in the west. And I heard air raid sirens outside of a funeral service for 3 soldiers who were killed in an attack on a military base not too far from here. That was on Sunday, the one that's very close to the Polish border. So constant reminders here, first of all, of a war happening in the whole of Ukraine, and how there's this tension in the air, of course, with air raid sirens going off at an increasing pace here, in fact, in Lviv.
Well, despite all that, the Ukrainian government advisor saying he expects the war to be over by early May. How likely is that?
Very difficult to give an opinion on that one, and the old expression, only time will tell, will have to be used in this case. Now, the person who said this is an advisor to the president's chief of staff, not somebody who is involved in these negotiations or talks with the Russian side, and the argument being that Russia might run out of resources. It is true that the Russian advances haven't been as fast as the Kremlin might have hoped for, that some of these forces and their vehicles have been bogged down during this 3-week-long invasion of Ukraine already, but the Russian military is still a formidable force, and according to the numbers at least, far, far superior in theory, on paper, to the Ukrainian armed forces, who are putting up fierce resistance. But there is absolutely no way of putting an end date, first of all, on this invasion, or of predicting any time. There might be, first of all, local ceasefires that will last, and then a general ceasefire, as far as we can tell right now, isn't a realistic outcome out of these talks that are happening right now between Ukraine and Russia.
And thanks for the update, Philip Crowther in Lviv, Western Ukraine.
Will Denslow joins us live now at Medyka. That's a Polish town on Ukraine's western border. Will, the Polish, Czech and Slovenian prime ministers, they've travelled to Kyiv to meet President Zelensky. What's the aim of their visit? And is it safe, considering the barrage of Russian airstrikes that we've seen on the capital?
Well, we heard from the Czech Prime Minister, Petr Fiala, who said that they were going to show their unequivocal support for Ukraine, its people, to promote the country's freedom and its independence, also promising a financial package for Ukraine going forward as well. When it comes to its safety, well, I suppose we'll have to wait and see. Certainly, they have done the calculations and estimate that it's a trip worth taking to show their solidarity for the people of Ukraine, as well as the country's leaders. Now, this all comes on a day we've heard from an advisor to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has said that partners still stand aside and are afraid of becoming global leaders. So that very much a veiled message that they want to see more done from the international community, especially NATO members. We've heard in the last few days they want to see more support when it comes from NATO regarding an increased supply of weapons into Ukraine to be used in the pushback against Russian forces, for even more stringent sanctions to be put in place on Moscow. And of course, there are those reiterated calls for a no-fly zone over Ukraine as well. So certainly this is an opportunity for those issues to be raised face-to-face with members of a European delegation.
Well, meantime, Will, there is this flood of Ukrainians that are arriving in Poland. More than 1.8 million refugees have entered the country now. The government there says that it needs more aid, though, from the EU to deal with that influx of people. What can it expect to get, though?
It's absolutely right, Dawn. If I step aside, you could probably just about make out the border behind me. We're at Medyka, which is the busiest border crossing. Thousands of Ukrainians have been crossing this border point into Poland every single day. You mentioned those figures. Around 1.8 million people have now crossed into Poland from Ukraine in a matter of just weeks. And there's a huge humanitarian relief effort here on the border. A huge amount of volunteers, NGOs, as well as assistance from the government. But we're hearing from officials is that more is needed. Already more than 300,000 refugees have entered the nation's capital, Warsaw, alone. We've heard from the mayor of Warsaw that says that he needs more assistance when it comes to the international community, be it the United Nations, be it the European Union, to create more systems in place to help them cope with the numbers of refugees that are only expected to keep rising in the coming days and weeks. This was very much a point reiterated by Andrzej Duda, the country's president, as well. He has urged other European nations to continue to open up their borders to alleviate some of the efforts that are going in to help share that burden a little wider as well. Of course, we've also had the World Bank for financial support for Poland. They've also announced a further $200 million when it comes to support and assistance for Ukraine. This comes after more than $700 million was pledged by the World Bank last week as they continue to put together this larger financial package set to be worth in the region of around $3 billion, Dawn.
A colossal effort to help those refugees pouring into Europe. Will, thank you for that. Will Denslow there at Medyka, Poland.
China says it does not want to be affected by the West's economic sanctions on Russia. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi insists the country is not a party to the crisis as pressure grows on Beijing to withdraw support from an isolated Moscow. Olivia Xiong joins us live from Beijing. Olivia, pressure really piling on Beijing there.
That's right. There's really been a flurry of diplomatic activity in the last few days as we've seen a growing number of countries trying to engage China, trying to urge China to do more, to play the role as mediator, as China has said that Russia is its most important strategic partner. But that's also where things get tricky because China has also so far refused to condemn Russia's military actions. But, you know, yesterday we saw China and the U.S. go into what has been described as very intense talks in Rome in person that lasted for 7 hours, where the Ukraine issue was among the issues that had been discussed. And we've also seen the UK now also say that China must not support Russia's invasion. And Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in the last few days has also held several phone calls, for example, with his counterparts in France and Germany, and today with Spain. Now, in the Chinese statement on this, it was made very clear that the phone call today with Spain was made at the request of the Spanish foreign minister, also saying that the Spanish side had asked China to play an active role in promoting peace. But Mr. Wang said that China has been pushing for peace talks, quote, in its own way as a permanent member of the UN Security Council from day one of this crisis in Ukraine, and that the Chinese side instead encouraged Russia and the Ukraine to reach a ceasefire through peace talks and for Europe and Russia to hold dialogue and negotiations on an equal basis. And all this comes amidst a backdrop between tension, against tension between China and the West, particularly with the US. And so there are questions as to how much of a role China would want to play in mediating in this situation. And we saw Mr. Wang hit out at, quote, some forces that have been constantly smearing China China's objective position on the Ukraine issue and creating disinformation. Now, no specific countries mentioned here, but this clearly an unmistakable reference to the U.S., as we've seen U.S. officials in reports say that Russia had asked China for military and economic support in Ukraine. This is something, though, that China and Russia continue to deny.
相信大家也都注意到了，俄罗斯总统新闻秘书佩斯科夫14日已经否认俄罗斯曾请求中方提供军事援助。美方不时制造和传播虚假信息，既不专业，也不道德，更不负责任。他们这样做只会让美国进一步失信于世界。
Earlier, you mentioned the difficult balance China is trying to maintain. It has not outrightly condemned Russian actions, yet is also trying to distance itself from Russian actions in Ukraine.
Yeah, China clearly trying to calibrate its position and what it says very carefully, as the U.S. has warned that there will be consequences if China supports Russia in any way. And so we see that in that same phone call that the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had with his Spanish counterpart also talked about sanctions. He did say that China has always been opposed to the use of sanctions to solve problems and tried to put distance between China and Russia, saying that China is not a party to this crisis and still less wants to be affected by these sanctions. And so Mr. Wang also made it very clear that China has the right to safeguard its legitimate interests. At the same time, some analysts I've spoken to say that China would be very careful to not overtly support Russia or be seen as being too enthusiastic in supporting Russia, and may only move to provide some sort of economic support when the war is over. This also, as China is very clear that it has economic interests with the EU and the US as well.
And thanks for that. Olivia Xiong speaking to us there from Beijing.